Alarms do not scare me. I have heard 1,000 alarms in my life, on 100 different ships, and every single time, the outcome was the same. Calm, control, victory. So when the alert light turned red on my command deck above the sleeping blue world called Earth, I did not even look up from my data screen. I assumed it was nothing. I was wrong. I am a general. My name is Vorn Kesh, and I have led the Tharsis Dominion's harvesting fleet for 11 long cycles. We have taken young ones from 6 different worlds, soft-skinned younglings from Drenner, silent, obedient hatchlings from the ice moons of Ket. Every single species we have gathered reacted the same way. They wept, they shook, they sat quietly in their holding pods and waited for someone to save them. It was simple, it was safe, it was profitable. Earth was supposed to be no different. My scouts told me Earth was a primitive world. Iron ships that could barely leave their own moon, governments that fought each other more than they fought outsiders, weapons that could not even reach low orbit reliably. My superiors called it a soft target, an easy harvest, low risk and high reward. I agreed. I signed the operation myself. We chose a coastal town, a place with tall glass towers, and a school full of children on a trip to see boats near the water. 40 of them, ages 9 to 13 according to our scans. We took them in less than 4 minutes, using a silent field that dropped over the pier like fog rolling in from the sea. No noise, no warning. My teams reported perfect extraction, 0 injuries, 0 resistance. I remember reading that report and feeling proud. I remember thinking, this will be the easiest cargo of my career. I did not sleep in the command chair that first night, not because I was worried, but because I wanted to watch the readings myself. 40 small heart rates, all elevated from fear, exactly as expected. Body temperature stable, oxygen levels normal. I watched the numbers glow on my screen, and felt something close to comfort. This is how it always begins. Fear, confusion, silence. Then, slowly, despair. By the 3rd day, most young ones from other worlds stop resisting entirely. They eat what we give them. They sleep when the lights dim. They wait, because waiting is what frightened children do. But there was one number I noticed that night, one detail buried in a corner of the display, that I did not think mattered. Group behavior indicator, irregular. My analyst told me it was a glitch, a small error in the biological sensors. Nothing worth a second look. I believed them. I had no reason not to. I had crushed the will of 6 species before this one. I assumed a 7th would be no different. I was already writing my report to the Dominion Council in my head, imagining the praise I would receive. 40 specimens, extracted without a single shot fired, without a single casualty. A clean mission. A perfect mission. My second in command, an officer named Drassic, came to me on the 2nd night, with a strange request. He asked permission to increase the number of guards near the holding bay. I laughed, actually laughed, and asked him if he was afraid of a group of frightened children who barely reached his chest in height. He did not answer right away, which should have told me something. He simply said that he had reviewed old intelligence files on Earth, buried deep in an archive nobody bothered to read anymore, describing human younglings as unusually resourceful, even dangerous in groups, even without weapons. I told him to stop reading old fairy tales and focus on his duties. I told him that fear does not care about resourcefulness. Fear breaks everyone the same way, given enough time and darkness. That night, I filed my after-action report early, confident that nothing else worth mentioning would happen before we reached the processing station. I remember the exact words I used. Mission successful, cargo secure, minimal complications expected. I sealed the report and sent it to the Dominion Council with something I rarely feel anymore after 11 cycles of this work: satisfaction. I believed, truly believed, that the hardest part of this operation was already finished. I believed the only thing left to do was wait quietly until we reached the station, hand over the cargo, and collect the praise that would follow. I did not know yet that somewhere below the deck I commanded, 40 children who should have been crying in the dark, were instead sitting in a circle, whispering to each other, counting footsteps outside their door, and starting to ask each other a very simple, very dangerous question. How do we get out of here? I did not hear that question. I did not see that circle. All I saw were numbers on a screen that told me everything was calm. I trusted those numbers completely, the same way I had trusted them on 6 other worlds, with 6 other harvests. all of which ended exactly the way I expected. I closed my eyes that night with the quiet confidence of a general who believed his war was already won, not knowing that the true story, the real danger, had not even begun. The first sign that something was wrong came from a maintenance report, the kind of dull, routine paperwork that usually crosses my desk without a single glance. A drone assigned to clean the lower corridors had gone silent, not damaged, not destroyed, simply silent, as if someone had reached into its small mechanical body and quietly turned off its mind. I read the report twice before I understood what it actually meant. Someone had done this on purpose. I called for Drassic immediately, and this time, I did not laugh when he arrived. He told me the drone had last been seen near the ventilation shaft outside the holding bay where the children were kept. My analysts assured me it was a random malfunction, nothing more, but I remembered the strange behavior indicator from 2 nights before. Group behavior indicator, irregular. I felt a small, cold feeling settle into my chest, a feeling I had not experienced in years. Doubt. I ordered the guards to check the holding bay in person, instead of relying only on cameras. What they found unsettled every officer who read the report after them. The children were not huddled in fear, as expected. They were sitting in small groups, speaking quietly, occasionally glancing at the corners of the room where our cameras were mounted. One boy, no older than 11, was staring directly into the lens of a camera when the guard entered, as if he already knew exactly where it was hidden. His name, according to our translation records taken from his school identification, was Noah. He did not flinch when the guard opened the door. He simply looked up, studied the guard's uniform for a long moment, and then looked back down, as if filing the information away for later use. I watched the recording of that moment more times than I would like to admit. There was no fear in his eyes. There was calculation. It reminded me of something my own officers do when they are planning a strategy, not something a frightened child does when facing captivity. I told myself I was imagining things, that fatigue was making me see patterns where none existed. I had led enough harvests to know that fear takes different forms in different species. Perhaps human fear simply looked different from what I expected. I clung to that explanation because the alternative was too uncomfortable to consider. 2 more incidents followed within hours of each other. A supply cabinet near the holding bay was found unlocked, though the access code required for it was known only to senior officers. When we checked the inventory, 3 small tools were missing, tools no larger than a human hand, items so minor that any other crew would have dismissed the loss entirely. I did not dismiss it. Small tools in the hands of frightened children should have meant nothing. Small tools in the hands of children who were quietly planning something meant everything. The third incident worried me the most. A guard named Threll reported that his restraint cuffs, the very tools meant to secure prisoners, had gone missing from his belt during a routine check of the holding bay. He had not noticed anyone approach him. He had not felt a single touch. It was only when he reached for his belt out of habit that he realized the cuffs were simply gone, as if they had never been there at all. When we reviewed the footage, we saw a girl, perhaps 12 years old, standing near him during the check, her hands folded politely behind her back, her face calm and unreadable. Her name was Grace. In the recording, she looked directly at the camera for exactly 1 second before looking away again, and in that single second, I felt something I had never felt from any other species we had harvested. I felt like I was being studied in return. I brought these findings to my science officer, a calm and logical woman named Ressa, and asked her to explain what she was seeing. She reviewed hours of footage in silence before speaking, and when she finally did, her voice carried none of its usual certainty. She told me that human younglings, according to what little research existed on their species, were raised in an environment unlike any other world we had harvested. They were taught, from a very young age, to solve problems without adult help. Games that required strategy. Lessons that rewarded patience and observation. Stories, passed down through their culture, that celebrated the clever, outsmarting the strong. She told me something that stayed with me, long after she left my command deck. Humans are not taught to survive by hiding. They are taught to survive by thinking. I did not want to believe her. I had spent 11 cycles learning that fear was a universal language, that every species eventually broke the same way when faced with captivity. I told myself these were isolated incidents, small acts of mischief that meant nothing in the larger picture. I told myself that 40 children, no matter how clever, could not possibly threaten a ship crewed by trained officers with advanced technology at their command. I told myself many things that night, comforting things, familiar things, the kind of things a general tells himself when he does not want to admit that his confidence was built on a foundation that was already cracking beneath him. I ordered increased patrols near the holding bay, doubled the guard rotation, and instructed my crew to review every inch of footage from the last 2 days without exception. I told myself this was simply caution, not fear. I told myself I was still in complete control of the situation, the same way I had been in control of 6 previous harvests. But somewhere in the back of my mind, a small and unwelcome thought had begun to grow, quiet at first, but impossible to ignore. What if the reason these children were not crying was not because they were too afraid to cry, but because they had already decided that crying would not help them, and that thinking might? I dismissed that thought as quickly as it arrived. I told myself I was overreacting to a handful of minor incidents, the kind of small problems that occur on every mission, regardless of the species involved. I told myself that tomorrow, when the ship reached deeper space and the children grew tired and hungry, and afraid of the unfamiliar hum of engines around them, they would settle into the same quiet despair that every other species eventually accepted. I told myself this, and for a few hours, I even believed it. I did not yet understand that somewhere below my feet, in a room meant to hold frightened prisoners, 40 children were not waiting to be rescued. They were preparing, quietly and carefully, to rescue themselves. The moment I truly understood how wrong I had been came without warning. In the middle of what should have been a routine shift change, an alarm tore through the ship, sharper and more urgent than anything I had heard since we left Earth's orbit. I rose from my chair immediately, expecting a hull breach or an engine failure, the kind of emergency I had trained for my entire career. What I received instead was a report that made no sense to me at first, the words arriving faster than my mind could process them. Fire suppression system activated. Cargo hold 3. No fire detected. I ordered every available camera in that section brought online at once. What I saw made my chest tighten in a way it had not tightened in years. 3 guards stood soaked from head to foot, coughing and rubbing chemical foam from their eyes, completely unable to see clearly for several long minutes. Behind them, a storage container that had been sealed and locked only hours earlier now stood wide open, its contents disturbed, several small items missing entirely. There was no fire. There had never been a fire. Someone had triggered the suppression system deliberately, using it as a weapon of confusion rather than a tool of safety, blinding 3 trained guards long enough to take exactly what they needed and disappear before anyone could stop them. I stood in silence for a long moment, staring at the screen, trying to convince myself that what I was seeing had a simple explanation, a system malfunction, a wiring error, anything other than the truth that was slowly forming in my mind, a truth I did not want to accept. This was not an accident. This was a plan, executed calmly and precisely, by children who I had assumed were too frightened to do anything except wait quietly in the dark. Drassic arrived on the command deck moments later, his expression tight with something I rarely saw in him: concern. He informed me that when the guards recovered enough to check their equipment, they discovered something even more disturbing than the missing supplies. 3 restraint cuffs, identical to the ones taken from Threll earlier, were found locked tightly around the ankles of the very guards, who had been blinded by the foam, binding them to a support beam in the corner of the room. Someone had used our own equipment against us, with a precision that suggested careful planning rather than panic or desperation. I asked the obvious question, the one that had been building in my mind since the very first strange report. Who did this? Drassic hesitated before answering, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight I had never heard from him before. The security footage, though partially obscured by the chemical foam, showed a small group of children moving through the cargo hold with a coordination that resembled a trained unit, rather than a group of frightened prisoners. 1 child near the door, watching the corridor. 2 children working quickly at the storage container. 1 child, the boy named Noah, standing calmly near the fire suppression control panel, his hand resting against it, with the quiet confidence of someone who understood exactly what he was doing. I asked Drassic to bring me the oldest of the captured children immediately, hoping that a direct conversation might reveal something the footage could not. A guard soon led a girl into my command deck, her wrists still marked faintly from the restraints she had worn during transport. though her expression showed none of the fear I expected. Her name, according to our records, was Lily. She was 12 years old, though she carried herself with a stillness that made her seem far older. I studied her for a long moment before speaking, trying to understand what kind of mind could remain so calm in a place designed to break the spirit of anyone who entered it. I asked her directly why the children had done what they did, expecting either silence or a burst of emotion. Instead, she looked at me with a calm, steady gaze and asked a question of her own, one that caught me completely off guard. She asked how much oxygen the ship carried in reserve, and how many hours it would last if the main systems failed. I sat in stunned silence for a moment, unable to understand why a frightened child would ask such a specific, tactical question instead of pleading for her freedom or crying for her family. When I did not answer immediately, she simply nodded, as if my silence had told her everything she needed to know, and looked away toward the small window behind my chair, studying the stars beyond it with quiet, patient interest. I dismissed her back to the holding bay, my mind spinning with questions I did not know how to answer. I had spent 11 cycles believing that fear was the great equalizer among all species, the one universal truth that made every harvest predictable and safe. I had believed that children, regardless of where they came from, were simply smaller and weaker versions of the adults who raised them, easily controlled once separated from the comfort of their families. Nothing about what I had just witnessed matched that belief. I called Ressa back to my command deck and asked her to explain, in detail, exactly what kind of upbringing could produce children capable of remaining calm under pressure, capable of planning coordinated actions without adult guidance, capable of asking about oxygen reserves instead of begging for mercy. She told me something that I have not been able to forget since that day. She explained that human children were raised in an environment filled with challenges most other species sheltered their young from entirely. They competed against each other from an early age, in games, in schoolwork, in countless small tests of skill and wit that most other species considered too harsh for something so young. They learned to lose, and to try again. They learned to work in groups without constant adult supervision, solving problems through debate and cooperation rather than obedience alone. She told me that where other species protected their young from difficulty, humans seemed to deliberately expose their young to it, believing that struggle, in careful and limited doses, built strength rather than damage. I sat with that explanation for a long time after she left, staring at the quiet stars outside my window, the same stars Lily had studied so calmly only minutes before. I began to understand, slowly and uncomfortably, that I had made a mistake far larger than any I had made in 11 cycles of service. I had not captured 40 frightened children, who would eventually break under pressure like every other species before them. I had captured 40 young minds, trained, without even realizing it themselves, to face fear with calculation, instead of surrender. I ordered a full review of every human record in our archives that night, searching desperately for something, anything, that might help me understand what kind of storm I had unknowingly invited onto my own ship. I found old reports, dismissed for cycles as exaggeration, describing human younglings surviving harsh conditions through teamwork and creativity that surprised even their own species observers. I found notes describing human culture as one that celebrated cleverness over strength, that told endless stories of small, seemingly powerless characters outwitting far larger and more powerful opponents through patience and wit alone. I had read these reports before, cycles ago, and dismissed them as cultural curiosities with no real military value. I understood now, far too late, exactly how wrong that judgment had been. By the time I finally left my command deck that night, exhausted and unsettled in a way I had never experienced before, I no longer believed I was simply managing a difficult cargo. I understood, with a growing and uncomfortable certainty, that somewhere below me, 40 children were not merely surviving their captivity. They were studying it, learning from every mistake my crew made, waiting patiently for the moment when their careful planning would finally be enough to set them free. I did not yet know how right that fear would prove to be, nor how completely the balance of power aboard my own ship had already begun to shift away from me. By the 4th day of our voyage, I no longer needed reports to tell me something was wrong. I could feel it in the way my crew moved through the corridors, glancing over their shoulders, even in sections of the ship far from the holding bay. I could hear it in the tone of my officers when they spoke to me, a tone that had shifted from routine confidence to careful hesitation. An entire supply deck, one level below the cargo hold where the children were kept, had gone quiet in a way that unsettled everyone who passed through it. Cameras in that section had stopped transmitting clear images, replaced instead by static that flickered on and off at odd intervals. When I sent a team to investigate, they found the wiring behind several camera panels neatly disconnected, not torn or broken, but carefully removed, as if someone had studied the wiring diagrams long enough to know exactly which connections to pull. I stood before those open panels myself, staring at the precise, careful work that had been done, and I felt something close to disbelief settle over me. These were children, some as young as 9 years old, working with tools they should not have understood, disabling equipment they should not have been able to identify. I asked Ressa how this was possible, how young minds with no technical training could disable our systems with such accuracy. She reminded me, gently but firmly, that human culture surrounded its young with technology from birth, teaching them to take apart and rebuild devices as a form of play, long before they were considered adults. What we saw as sabotage, she explained, the children likely saw as simply another puzzle to solve, no different from the games and challenges they had grown up mastering on their own world. I ordered my crew to retake the supply deck immediately, expecting a quick and simple operation against a handful of unarmed children. What followed instead became one of the most humbling experiences of my long career. My officers advanced through the corridor in careful formation, only to find the lights suddenly cut from beneath them, plunging the entire deck into darkness broken only by the dim emergency glow along the floor. In the chaos that followed, 3 officers reported slipping on a section of floor that had been deliberately coated with a slick cleaning solution taken from a nearby storage closet, sending them tumbling before they even reached the main door. Another officer reported a loud, sudden noise erupting from a speaker overhead. A recording of alarm sirens looped and amplified, disorienting the entire team long enough for a group of children to slip past them entirely, moving in the opposite direction, toward a supply room my officers had already searched and left unguarded. When my team finally regained control of their formation and reached the end of the corridor, they discovered the true purpose of the diversion. A storage room, containing spare uniforms and identification badges, had been opened, several items missing, along with a small toolkit meant for minor equipment repairs. I understood immediately what this meant, and the realization struck me with a force I had not expected. These children were no longer simply reacting to their captivity. They were actively working to disguise themselves, to move through my ship unnoticed, to gather tools and resources for a plan far larger than anything I had imagined when we first brought them aboard. I called an emergency meeting with my senior officers that evening, and for the first time since I had taken command of this fleet, I saw genuine uncertainty on every face around the table. Drassic suggested increasing security measures across the entire ship, doubling patrols and restricting movement in every corridor near the holding bay. Ressa suggested a different approach entirely, warning that treating the children as a growing threat, rather than frightened prisoners, might only encourage them to escalate their efforts further. I listened to both suggestions carefully, aware that neither option felt entirely safe, and aware, uncomfortably, that I no longer trusted my own instincts the way I once had. While we debated our next move, an urgent message interrupted our meeting, one that made every officer at the table fall silent. The ship's internal communication system, the very network we use to issue commands and coordinate our crew, had been accessed without authorization. A voice, calm and steady, spoke through the speakers in every section of the ship at once, addressing my crew directly. It was Lily, the same girl I had spoken with only days earlier, her voice carrying none of the fear I had expected from a captured child. She spoke slowly and clearly, explaining that the children did not wish to harm anyone aboard the ship, but that they intended to find a way home, one way or another. She then listed several requests, written, as I later learned, on a torn piece of paper using a colored writing tool taken from a supply closet, requests that ranged from access to communication equipment to information about our current location in the space between worlds. I remember staring at that torn piece of paper when it was finally brought to me, the handwriting simple and childlike, yet the logic behind each request more precise and effective than many strategic plans I had reviewed during my years of service. I found myself laughing quietly, not out of amusement, but out of a strange and painful recognition. I had trained for cycles to counter enemy fleets, hostile boarding parties, and rival commanders skilled in the art of war. Nothing in that training had prepared me to face a plan written in crayon by children who understood my ship's weaknesses better than some of my own officers did. The situation grew more difficult with each passing hour. Reports arrived of small groups of children moving through ventilation shafts too narrow for any adult to follow, appearing briefly on distant cameras before vanishing again into the ship's hidden pathways. Supplies continued to disappear in small, carefully measured amounts, never enough to raise immediate alarm, but always enough to suggest careful planning toward some larger goal. My crew, trained for combat against armed enemies and hostile fleets, found themselves completely unprepared for an opponent who used patience, misdirection, and quiet determination instead of open confrontation. I began to notice something else troubling during this time, something that unsettled me even more than the sabotage itself. My own crew, exhausted and increasingly anxious, started to whisper among themselves in the corridors, their confidence in my leadership visibly shaken. Some questioned whether we should abandon the mission entirely and return the children to their world before the situation worsened further. Others argued that doing so would be seen as weakness, a surrender to a group of frightened younglings that would damage the Dominion's reputation among other fleets. I found myself torn between these two positions, uncertain for the first time in 11 cycles whether the mission I had once considered simple and safe could truly be completed without consequences none of us were prepared to accept. I requested another meeting with Lily, hoping that direct conversation might help me understand exactly what the children intended to do if their requests were not met. She arrived calm and composed, as she always did, and sat across from me without any trace of fear in her expression. I asked her plainly what would happen if we refused to cooperate with her group's demands. She considered the question carefully before answering, her voice steady and thoughtful beyond her years. She told me that the children had no interest in causing harm to anyone aboard the ship, but that they would continue finding ways to make our voyage as difficult as possible until we agreed to return them home. She reminded me, almost gently, that we were the ones who had taken them from their families without warning, and that everything happening now was simply the result of that choice. Her words settled over me with a weight I had not expected from someone so young. I had spent so many cycles viewing our harvests as routine operations, numbers on a report, cargo to be collected and delivered. I had never truly considered what it meant to remove a child from the arms of their family, from the comfort of their home, and place them somewhere unfamiliar and frightening, without any explanation at all. Lily's calm, steady gaze reminded me, more effectively than any lecture from my superiors ever had, that the children aboard my ship were not simply difficult cargo to be managed. They were young lives disrupted entirely by decisions I had made without a second thought. By the end of that difficult day, my command deck had become a place of quiet tension rather than confident authority. Reports continued to arrive describing small acts of resistance throughout the ship, each one more creative and effective than the last. My crew, once certain of their superiority over a primitive world, now moved through their own ship with a caution I had never witnessed before. I sat alone that night, staring at the same stars Lily had studied so calmly during our first conversation, and allowed myself, for the first time since this mission began, to seriously consider an outcome I had never imagined possible. Perhaps we had made a mistake, far larger than any simple miscalculation about Earth's technology or defenses. Perhaps we had underestimated something far more dangerous than weapons or warships. We had underestimated the quiet, patient determination of children who had learned, long before we ever arrived in their skies, how to solve problems no one expected them to face alone. I did not yet know how quickly that mistake would catch up with us, nor how little time remained before the consequences of our actions arrived at our very door. The alert that changed everything arrived quietly, almost gently, compared to the chaos of the previous days. My communications officer, a steady and careful man named Ellis, approached my command chair with a look on his face that told me this report would be different from the others. He explained that our long-range sensors had detected a series of signals following our exact flight path since we left Earth's orbit, signals so faint and carefully disguised that our systems had only just managed to identify them as deliberate tracking devices rather than random cosmic interference. Someone from Earth had been following us the entire time, silently and patiently, without revealing themselves until now. I felt a chill move through me that had nothing to do with the temperature of my command deck. I had been told, cycle after cycle, that Earth possessed no meaningful ability to detect ships beyond their own atmosphere, let alone track a vessel moving through open space, at speeds their technology supposedly could not match. I asked Ellis to confirm the source of these signals, hoping desperately for some explanation other than the one already forming in my mind. He confirmed what I feared most. The signals originated from human technology far more advanced than anything our intelligence reports had ever described, technology that had remained hidden from every scout and observer we had sent to study their world. I called Ressa to my side immediately, demanding an explanation for how our reports had failed so completely to identify a threat of this scale. She reviewed the data in silence for several long minutes, before offering an answer that unsettled me more than any sabotage the children had carried out. She explained that humans, throughout their long and difficult history, had developed a habit of keeping their most important discoveries hidden from public knowledge, sharing only carefully selected information with the wider world, while quietly advancing far beyond what outsiders believed possible. Our scouts had studied what humans allowed them to see. They had never come close to understanding what humans chose to keep hidden. While I struggled to process this new and frightening reality, a second report arrived that pushed the situation beyond anything I could control through strategy or patience alone. Multiple vessels, small and swift, had entered detection range around our ship, moving with a precision and coordination that left no doubt in my mind about their purpose. These were not primitive machines built by a species unfamiliar with space travel. These were carefully designed rescue craft, built and launched in secret, sent specifically to recover the children we had taken from their world. I stood before my command screen, watching those small vessels approach with a growing and undeniable sense of dread, and I understood, with complete clarity, exactly what kind of mistake I had made from the very beginning. I had assumed that a species capable of building only simple ships and modest weapons must be simple in every other way as well. I had failed to consider that a civilization's greatest strength might not lie in the size of its fleets or the power of its weapons, but in the patience, cleverness, and quiet determination of every single person within it, including the very youngest among them. Drassic approached me with a request that surprised me, though perhaps it should not have. He asked whether we should prepare our defenses, whether we should meet this unexpected human fleet with the same strength and confidence that had guided every decision I had made throughout my long career. I considered his question carefully, weighing every option available to me, and found myself returning again and again to the same uncomfortable truth. We had taken these children without warning, without permission, and without any true understanding of the people we had chosen to provoke. Meeting their rescue effort with resistance now would only prove, beyond any doubt, that we deserved whatever consequences followed. I made my decision that day, one that I know surprised every officer serving under my command. I ordered my crew to prepare the holding bay for immediate release, to gather every child safely and calmly, and to prepare a full and honest account of everything that had happened during our voyage. I did not do this out of fear alone, though I will admit, fear played its part. I did this because somewhere during those long, difficult days aboard my ship, I had come to understand something I should have known from the very beginning of my career. Strength is not measured only by weapons or technology. It is measured by the willingness of an entire people, from their oldest leaders to their youngest children, to face impossible circumstances with patience, cleverness, and quiet, unshakable resolve. When the children gathered near the holding bay doors, prepared finally to return to the small rescue vessels waiting outside our ship, Lily approached me one final time. She did not smile, nor did she offer any words of comfort or forgiveness. She simply looked at me with the same calm, steady gaze she had carried since our very first conversation, and asked whether I now understood why her people had never been as harmless as we assumed. I told her, honestly and without hesitation, that I did. As the children boarded the small human vessels and disappeared safely into the vast darkness surrounding Earth, I remained on my command deck, watching the quiet blue world grow smaller through my window. I began composing my final report to the Dominion Council that evening, though it bore little resemblance to the confident, satisfied message I had sent only days earlier. I described, in careful and honest detail, everything that had happened during our voyage. I explained how children we had assumed would be easily controlled had instead outmaneuvered trained officers, using nothing more than patience, teamwork, and clever thinking, learned through ordinary lessons and everyday play. I explained how an entire civilization we had judged as primitive and harmless had, in truth, hidden capabilities far beyond anything our scouts had ever reported. I ended my report with a recommendation I knew would surprise the council, though I no longer cared how it might affect my own reputation among them. I advised that Earth be removed immediately from our list of harvestable worlds, not because their weapons posed a direct threat to our fleets, but because their people, even their very youngest members, possessed a form of strength far more dangerous than any weapon we had ever encountered. I described it as a quiet, patient resilience, built through generations of struggle and challenge, passed down not through military training, but through simple games, everyday lessons, and countless small moments of learning that most other species would never think to value. In the quiet days that followed our retreat from Earth's system, I found myself returning often to my final conversation with Lily, replaying her calm, steady words in my mind. I had spent 11 cycles believing that fear was the great equalizer among all species, the one universal truth that made every harvest predictable and simple. I understood now, with complete and humbling clarity, that I had been wrong. Fear may weaken many, but it does not weaken everyone equally, and it certainly had not weakened the children of a world we so carelessly underestimated. I never received a formal response from the Dominion Council regarding my report, though word eventually reached me that Earth had been quietly added to a very short and very cautious list of worlds our fleets were instructed never to approach again. I do not know what became of Lily, or Noah, or Grace, or any of the other children who spent those difficult days aboard my ship. I do not know whether they ever spoke of what happened to anyone beyond their own families, or whether the memory of their capture faded quietly into the background of their ordinary lives. What I do know, with absolute certainty, is that somewhere on that small, quiet blue world, an entire civilization continues to raise its children in a way that teaches them to face impossible odds, not with despair, but with patience, cleverness, and quiet, unshakable determination. I close this account with the same thought that has stayed with me since the night those small rescue vessels carried the children safely home. We did not simply make a mistake when we chose to take those 40 children from their world. We revealed, through our own carelessness, exactly how unprepared we truly were to face a species we had never taken the time to understand, and somewhere among the stars we once considered ours to explore freely, a quiet, resilient world now watches carefully, waiting to see whether we, or anyone like us, will ever be foolish enough to return.